Lovely. Yeah. So this evening, as I said, we're going to look at a sutta or a teaching from the Pali Canon. And this evening, what we're looking at is the Kalama Sutta. Some of you will know the Buddha was around about 2,500 years ago. And after his enlightenment, so after he went through this radical shift of consciousness, that was the end of a long search for him, a search of what's the answer to human suffering, basically. And he found the answer to that within himself. And that involved a radical change of consciousness which completely changed his being. And this is what the Buddha on the shrine represents. That's what the Buddha represents, is a different kind of human being. So one that doesn't experience suffering in the way that we experience it. Because he's gone beyond that. He's seen deeply into the nature of suffering and transformed it from within himself. And after his enlightenment, he spent the rest of his life teaching. And that happened in sort of various contexts. But the Buddha spent a lot of his time just wandering around, going from place to place, or for periods of time he would be in a particular place and people would come and see him. And people often came to see the Buddha with like an issue or a question. So they'd have something that they're not sure about, or they'd have something that they wanted to ask his advice on, and they would go and see him individually, or a group of people would go and see him. And this evening, we're going to learn about the Kalamas. So this was, I don't really know. It was like a clan or something like that in northern India. So it was a group of people in northern India. And the Buddha's passing through their land, basically. He's passing through a town called Kesaputta, which is a place where the Kalamans live. And the Buddha's reputation precedes him. And they've heard that he's this very wise teacher. They've heard that he's very honorable. They've heard that his reputation is basically that he knows what he's talking about, and that he's a kind of very special being. So they want to ask him a question because they're confused about something. So that's setting up tonight's episode. You can catch it in 8 box sets over the next however many. That's tonight's story, basically. And I wanted to just set that up before we go into meditation. So I'll say a little bit more about that after we meditate. But let's have a period of meditation. So welcome to those of you that have just joined us, and also welcome to those of you online as well. As I said, we're looking at teachings from the Pali Canon over the last couple of weeks and a few weeks to come. And these are stories and episodes from the Buddha's life. They're the oldest teachings that we have, and they're usually, they're always in fact, actual utterances or direct communication from the Buddha. So it's actually the Buddha's words rather than things being written about him or commentary or so on. And this evening what I'm going to talk about is a teaching called the Kalama Sutta, where there's a group of people called the Kalamas, and the Buddha comes to their town and they've got a question for him. And as I said, it seems like the Buddha's reputation precedes him. So if you can imagine what it was like in ancient India, like 2,500 years ago, there was no media, there was no printed press, but what there was lots of people wandering about, news and things like that would travel, I guess, through trade routes and that sort of thing. And then you also had kind of spiritual teachers wandering around. And this is what the Kalamas want to talk to the Buddha about. And this was part of the tradition that the Buddha was part of. So he was a teacher that people would come to see him, and he would go to see people as well. So the Buddha has a certain reputation as a very, very wise man. So they want to put this issue to him. And in the sutta, it kind of sets the scene, and it talks about how the Kalamas approach the Buddha. And it says that some pay homage to him, some sit down on one side, some exchange greetings with him, and there's some sort of cordial, informal chat. Some pronounce their name and family and they sit down on one side. Some people don't speak. And then eventually somebody actually speaks to the Buddha. So that's really lovely, isn't it? I really liked that. I liked the idea of, I don't know, just the fact that even though they're not followers of the Buddha, it's important to say that about the Kalamas. This is important for the story, is they're not the Buddha's followers. They're coming to him with a particular issue or a question, but, they don't owe him anything in a certain sense. They're not his followers. They're not committed to him or anything like that. And yet they're still very, I don't know, kind of receptive or, formal, respectful. You could say they're very, very respectful. So even though they don't know who the Buddha is, they're respectful and they're receptive to him, basically. And I think you could take this as a metaphor or an allegory for how we should approach teachings as well. So even if we don't know them, actually approaching with a sort of an open mind, basically. Anyway, eventually one of the Kalamas speaks to the Buddha, and this is what he says. He says, "There are some monks and Brahmins, Venerable Sir, who visit Kesaputta," so that's their town. "They expound and explain only their own doctrines. The doctrines of others they despise, revile, and pull to pieces. Some other monks and Brahmins too, Venerable Sir, come to Kesaputta. They also explain only their own doctrines. The doctrines of others they despise, revile, and pull to pieces. Venerable Sir," that's how they address the Buddha. "Venerable Sir, there is doubt, there is uncertainty in us concerning them. Which of these revered monks and Brahmins spoke the truth, and which falsehood?" So what they're saying is, look, all of these teachers come, and all of them say, mine is the true teaching, and you can't trust the teaching of anyone else. What I'm saying is more important to you than anything else anyone else can say to you. This is the most important thing. What everyone else says isn't important. Yeah, does that make sense to you all? You all look really worried, by the way. I don't know, have I said something weird or something like that? You all look a little bit like, I don't know, I'm going to do something like I'm going to hurt you or something. I don't know. Anyway, look, it's fine. You can relax. Does that make sense, what I was saying about their teaching? Yeah, okay. So does this remind you of anything? Lots of different people saying lots of different things, and everybody says that their thing is the true thing, and everybody else, what they're saying isn't true. Does that remind you of anything?
Twitter?
Say again?
Twitter?
Yeah, it could be Twitter, couldn't it? Yeah, absolutely. Anything else? Politicians, yeah. I was saying there's no media in this time, but it does remind me a little bit of, what does it remind you of today in our culture? So it could be Twitter, it could be something else.
Religions.
Say again?
Different religions.
Could be maybe. I don't know. I think a lot of religions are respectful of each other, actually. I don't know.
Ethics.
Maybe. But say again?
Ethics.
Ethics in what way?
Because everyone has his own ethic.
Okay, yeah. So that's a bit like what you were saying, isn't it? It's different religions have different things. Yeah. I thought a bit like what you were saying. I thought it was a little bit like the online world, isn't it? So you could say Twitter, or you could say YouTube. You know, like when you go on YouTube and everything's like, just do this one thing. You know, you need to forget about this and you need to do this. So it's a little bit like that in the online world, isn't it? It's like it's hard to make sense of who's actually saying what, because everybody says that the thing that they're saying is the most important thing. So I was listening to a talk by a friend of mine the other day, Pranyamanis, who used to teach at this class, and he was talking about YouTube and saying this about that, basically, that it's hard, you know, that it's hard to make sense of what each person's saying. And he did this thing where he said, okay, look, I'm just going to randomly go on my YouTube feed and tell you what comes up to prove this point. But I did this and it didn't work very well. So this was my YouTube feed. Control synthesis, deep bass, acid 9 techno jam with Nord drum and Novation circuit. That was one. Why the Tour de France is exclusively for insane people. I like endurance cycling. Touring a Scandinavian loft apartment. And South Korea's underground tattoo scene, the women defying the law. And then the final one was a Vice documentary, the 10,000 calorie diet. This is what sumo wrestlers eat. Now, I don't know how that last one came up, basically. It's this really weird thing. I live in a small community with 2 other people. Oscar is one of them at the back. And I've got a reputation in my community for never eating anything. Like I said, I'm into endurance cycling, and there's this joke that basically I cycle like 120 miles and then I might eat a biscuit at the end of it. It's true. Verified by Oscar. But for some reason, in my YouTube feed, I started getting videos of this guy who does competitive eating. Has anybody? I don't recommend it. It's awful. It's just somebody doing like eating lots of food for sport, basically. And I clicked on one of the videos once, and now I'm getting documentaries about what sumo wrestlers eat. Anyway, leaving that aside for the moment, so there's not much spiritual in there, and it doesn't sound like people are sort of competing, but it is a bit like that on YouTube, isn't it? Sometimes you can there's none of that there, but it's a little bit like, just do these 3 things, and that will be all you need to do, basically. Train in this way, don't train in that way. If you want to get rich, this is the way to do it. That's not the way to do it. If you want to be happy, this is the way to do it. This isn't the way to do it. And I think the thing about that is it's interesting because in that format, and as you said on Twitter, it's almost like everything's presented like equally. Do you know what I mean? There's a certain democracy to online space, isn't there? So you could read, I don't know, some sort of article or something like that, and in a way it's the same, it's presented in the same form as something that's just on Wikipedia, isn't it? And I think in our minds there's something that happens whereby, because it's just there on screen, it's almost like it has the same validity or something like that. Is that just me, or do you know what I mean? Yeah. I did a master's when I was in my 30s, and I remember one of our lecturers, we were talking about writing essays, and he said, remember, there's fact, and then there's wiki fact, which I thought was a good way to look at it. So everything's presented equally, and it's not easy to know kind of how to navigate what's true and what isn't. And it seems like this was true in the Buddha's time as well. The Kalamas were basically going to the Buddha and saying, look, we're getting all these different people saying that theirs is the true teaching. How do you actually know what is worth listening to? What should we actually pay attention to, and what can we ignore? So first of all, the way the Buddha replies to them, they're saying, look, what should we do? And the Buddha, first of all, says that it's right that they should have these kind of doubts, which I think is lovely. So he encourages them right from the start. He's very, very encouraging them. He said, look, it's right that you should have these kind of doubts. When people speak in this way, naturally what is going to arise is doubt. That will be a natural response to that. And what the Buddha doesn't do is he doesn't say, well, no, actually all of those people are wrong and my teaching is the true teaching. He doesn't do that at all. What he does is he encourages them to step back and take a sort of a analytical view of all of these teachings, including his own. And that's what I really, really love about this teaching, is the Buddha's saying, look, you need to take a step back and you need to apply certain criteria to these teachings that will make sense for you, but you can include my teaching in that. I'm not going to just sit here and say to you, just ignore everybody else and listen to what I have to say. So I'll read you what the Buddha actually says. He says, it's proper for you, Kalamas, to doubt, to be uncertain. Uncertainty has arisen in you about what is doubtful. Come, Kalamas, do not go upon what has been acquired by repeated hearing, nor upon tradition, nor upon rumour, nor upon what is in a scripture, nor upon surmise, nor upon axiom. So axiom, I think, means it's something that is regarded as just true without any need for explanation. Nor upon specious reasoning, nor upon a bias towards a notion that has been pondered over, nor upon another's seeming ability, nor upon the consideration the monk is our teacher. Kalamas, when you yourselves know these things are bad, these things are blamable, these things are censured by the wise, undertaken and observed, these things lead to harm and ill, abandon them. So it's amazing, isn't it? It's a pretty comprehensive list that the Buddha says, look, you can't trust things just because other people say that it's the case. You can't trust things just because people say that it's true, that if it's axiomatic. You can't trust something just because it's a scripture. So you can't trust what I'm saying just because I'm sitting here telling you that it's the Buddha's teaching. So in a way, he turns it back on his head. He says, you can't even trust my teaching just because I tell you it's true, and I'm the Buddha. You can't trust that alone, basically. And there's this point, isn't it, where the Buddha says, nor upon the consideration the monk is our teacher. So what he's saying is you can't trust my teaching, and you can't even trust someone's teaching 100% just because they're your teacher. So if you've committed to someone and you've already made a commitment to that teacher, you still can't 100% trust, or you shouldn't take completely on faith what they say just because they're your teacher. So the Kalamas aren't followers of the Buddha, as I said, and he's saying to them basically, you can't rely on someone else's seeming ability, nor upon the consideration that the monk is our teacher. And he includes himself in that. So he takes a step back, and he doesn't try to convince them of his own teaching. He basically gives them a set of criteria and simple guidelines and principles that they can use to navigate their way through their own doubts. And this is actually a teaching in itself. So in a way, the Buddha's not giving them a teaching, but in not giving them a teaching, that is a teaching, if you see what I mean. Do you get what I'm saying? Yeah? Okay. So he actually gives them a set of criteria. And the first set of criteria is this. He says, what do you think, Kalamas? Does greed, hatred, ill will, or delusion appear in a man for his benefit or harm? And they say, for his harm, Venerable Sir. He says, Kalamas, being given to greed and being overwhelmed and vanquished mentally by greed, this man takes life, steals, commits adultery, and tells lies, and he prompts others too to do likewise. Will that be for his harm or his ill? And they say, for his ill. So he's taking it sort of right back to the start, and he's saying, look, if you have a teaching, you need to think about whether it's actually going to bring about benefit or whether it's going to bring about suffering. Is it going to bring about benefit for you, for other people, or is it going to conduce to more harm and more suffering? So the Buddha's in a way saying, forget about the teaching. You don't need to believe in complicated teachings, but obviously what will make sense to you on its own level is this going to bring about harm or is this going to bring about suffering? And not just that. He's very keen to say, he says, Kalamas, when you yourself know that these things are good, that these things are not blamable, that these things are praised by the wise, undertaken and observed, these things lead to benefit and happiness. He says, enter on and abide in them. So what he's saying there is, it's not even enough to decide for yourself whether a teaching brings about benefit or not, or to just decide that in a kind of an abstract sense. You need to actually understand that for yourself. So it needs to actually have an effect in your life, and you need to understand that for yourself. So the Buddhist teaching is not an abstract teaching. It's like you need to have actually experienced that for yourself so that you can see in practice what the teaching's talking about. So what we're in the kind of arena of here is, I think the Buddha's talking about different sort of views and beliefs. So these teachers are coming, and they've all got these different belief systems. And, they're talking to the people that they come across, and people choose whether to take those on board or not. And what the Buddha's saying is, if you take someone's teaching on board, that is going to change the way that you behave, and that's going to have an effect. And there's going to be, it's going to have an effect in the world, it's going to have an effect on you, it's going to have an effect on them. So you need to understand what the actual belief is that you're taking on board and what the consequences of that will be. So I was thinking about this a little bit, and I was trying to, maybe you could help me a little bit with this. I was thinking about what's the difference between a view and a belief? So can anyone help me out with that? What does anyone think?
My initial reaction was that a view is open to being changed.
Oh, right, okay, yeah,
and a belief is more like firmly set.
Right, okay, so a belief could be something that's firmly set, yeah. And definitely our views can change, can't they? Like our views change over our life, for sure. Yeah, that's really important. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
I think one difference is a belief might indicate that there's a degree of investment that you've placed in it.
Right, okay.
Time, energy,
right,
practice.
Okay. I think that might be true, but I think that's true of a view, actually. I'll come back to that in a moment. So let's examine that a little bit. Yeah. Anyone else have anything to add to that?
I don't know why, but a belief to me just seems so much more solid than a view.
Right, okay.
A view feels to me like it has a quality to it that is or could be changed.
Yeah.
Whereas a belief is something very sturdy and and unshakable.
Yeah. So a belief, I'm partly repeating just for people who are online. So a belief is something that seems like it's solid, unchangeable, and a view is something that can be changed, and it's a bit softer, a bit more malleable. Yeah. I think, like I was thinking about this afternoon, I think what you're all saying is true. I was thinking it's like a belief is a kind of an explicit external thing almost, and then if we subscribe to a belief, that then becomes a view for us. Like we have certain views, but most of the time our views are unacknowledged or they're unconscious. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense? Because this is quite important. Do you understand what I mean about we all have views? What would an example of a view be, for example? An example be, for example? Sorry, I'll say example one more time in that sentence, for example. What would an example of a view be? You should have 3 meals a day. Yeah, that might be a view. Yeah. Anything non-nutritional?
Tour de France is only for insane people.
Right. Yeah. That's a view, isn't it? Yeah. Anything else?
Money will make me happy.
Money will make you happy. Yeah, I was going to say we're getting like not very what's the word? Innocuous, slightly less innocuous, not very innocuous. So money will not make you happy. That's money will make you happy. That's quite a strong view, isn't it? So it's important for us to realize that we all have certain views. We're carrying around certain views, and most of the time those views will be unconscious. And a lot of what we're trying to do in Buddhist practice is to bring our views into awareness and to examine them and actually make them conscious, and actually decide whether we want to live by those views or not. Because in a certain way of speaking, we live by our views. And if they're unconscious, we'll be living in such a way that we're being driven by unconscious views. And of course, because they're unconscious, by definition, we're not even aware of them. So these might be views that we've inherited from our family. It might be views that we've inherited from our culture. And then not all of them will be unhelpful. Some of them may be helpful up to a point. I'll maybe get onto that later. It's interesting. It said the Buddha had no view, basically. So the Buddha has no views about anything. All he has is a consciousness which is completely, words start to break down a little bit, a consciousness which is of reality. So there's no taint of any kind of view or opinion. The Buddha will just tell you how things are, basically. That's what he's doing, is reflecting reality back. He speaks completely from a place of reality, not from opinion, not from view, but from reality. But for us, everything that we say and think and do will be driven by our unconscious views a lot of the time. So I thought I'd get you to have a look at this a little bit. I'd like us to do a little exercise. So I'd like you to pair up with someone else. Doesn't have to be the person next to you, but pair up with someone else. And I'd like you to think about and talk about. Think of a view that you have previously held that you have now let go of. So something that you believed was true, or that you held close to you as a view that you've now let go of. And then what was the effect of having that view, and what was the effect of letting go of it? Does that make sense? So think of a view that you've held in your life that you've let go of, that has changed. As we were saying, views can change. We can let go of them. Think of a view that you used to hold that you've let go of. What was the effect of having it, and what's been the effect of letting it go? Just the thing that I was saying really before we stopped for tea was saying these views that we hold are unconscious a lot of the time. We don't actually know that they're there. So often we don't see, what this teaching's about is trying to actually see things clearly and have a sense of what is valuable and what's not valuable. But often what can get in the way of that is we have very, very strong views about things, and often those views are unconscious. So unless we bring those views into more and more awareness, we won't actually see how they're conditioning our life or the effect that they're having on our life. And they'll stop us from seeing things clearly, basically. It's like we're always looking through a particular lens. And that lens may be helpful, it may be unhelpful, but it's a lens nonetheless. And as I was saying before, the Buddha doesn't have that lens at all. There's nothing between him and reality. But the degree to which we have that lens will be behaving in a certain way, and often we're not even aware of it, basically. So I was thinking about this in relation to my own life. So when I was young, I was very hedonistic, was very into kind of drink and drugs, and I had a belief that intoxication was a form of freedom. So I basically unconsciously gravitated towards that, because to me that represented freedom. And I also had a view that I wasn't doing myself or anyone else any harm, because what harm could I possibly be doing by, I don't know, just drinking and taking drugs and so on. And slowly, through years and years of Buddhist practice, the view that I have around that started to change. And I started to see not only was that not true, but actually went from a sort of a view of that, you know, that I did what I did in my past, but that was probably okay, to actually coming more to a relationship with the truth, I think, which is that I probably did, well, in fact, I definitely did cause myself harm, and I caused other people harm as well. But it's not easy to face up to that. It's not comfortable to face up to that. And it's often not always easy to face up to our views. And we often can't do that on our own because they're unconscious, basically. So it's really important that we try and make these things more conscious. And meditation is one of the ways that we do that. I'll say a bit more about how we can do that in different ways later. But, you know, we were meditating earlier this evening, and obviously in Buddhism we place a huge emphasis on meditation. Part of the effect of meditation is that it will bring your views more and more to the surface. You'll become more aware of what it is that's actually driving the way you approach things and the way that you see things. So that's one of the things that meditation can help with, and it's really, really essential for actually trying to see things more clearly, and not just... What we tend to do is we seek things out that validate the views that we have. So rather than sort of challenging our own views or making our own views more conscious, we just gravitate towards things that confirm our own worldview. So I was chatting with a friend about this the other day. In relation to those views that I held, I also had a view that when I was younger, I just grew up in a heavy drinking culture. I grew up around people who, you know, my friends drank and took drugs and so on. And I thought, well, that's just the culture that I grew up in. So I grew up in a small town in the north of England, but not everybody was getting hammered every weekend. You know, it's like I gravitated towards those people, basically. And I gravitated towards the people that were doing that because I wanted to be with people that shared a similar view, because it meant that I then didn't have to look at my own view and the effect that it was having on me. Does that make sense to all of you? Yeah. So it's really important that we examine things for ourselves. But as I was saying, we can't necessarily always do that sort of neutrally. Like, we all bring certain views to what we see. And the Buddha talks about this in the Sutta, basically. It's interesting. This Sutta is very, very, very misunderstood. Because in it, the Buddha says basically that you can't, as I was saying at the start, he says, look, you can't rely on the testimony of others. You can't rely on axioms. You can't rely on what somebody says just because they're a spiritual teacher. But the thing about that is that doesn't just mean that you can reject, that you have to reject what anyone else says and kind of go your own way. So this sutta often gets misconstrued as the Buddha saying that, basically saying like you can only trust yourself, or there's that phrase, isn't there? If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. I don't know if anybody's heard that. So it's like it sort of affirms this very, very individualistic tendency that we have in our culture, because it misconstrues the sutta and just takes part of it out of context and makes it sound like the Buddha is saying, look, you can't trust anything apart from your own experience. The Buddha's not saying that. What he's saying is, you need to look at things in your own experience and you need to test it out in your own experience, but that's not a good enough criteria in itself, because we all carry these views around, basically. The less enlightened we are, the less we see reality as it actually is, and the more our minds are conditioned by the views that we have, whatever they are. We had a couple of examples. I gave you an example of my own, and you'll have all been talking about those in your pairs. And you'll have lots and lots and lots of views, and most of them you won't be aware of. So the Buddha also says we can't entirely trust our own perception, basically. And he says we shouldn't just plump for ideas that we like and reject those that we don't. And as I said, this half of the teaching is largely ignored by people, basically. But there's an additional helpful criteria or condition that the Buddha sets out. And he says, he talks about things being praised by the wise. So he says, he talks about things being praised by the wise, and he says, when undertaken and observed by the wise, these things lead to benefit and happiness. So if somebody who appears wise says that something is true, and then there's this phrase, isn't there, undertaken and observed. So it's not just if they say that, it's if somebody is actually undertaking a teaching or a training or whatever it is, and they are observing that in their own life. Do you see the difference? So it's like somebody has actually taken on a particular way of living, and they are living it in their own life, and it's obvious that they are living that in their own life. So do you think that's a good criteria? So, I mean, for me, there's a whole other question about how do we actually know if someone's wise? I mean, well, let me ask you first. So this is what the Buddha says. He says, look, if it's something is praised by the wise and undertaken and observed, and these things lead to benefit and happiness, do you think that's a good criteria, that something is praised by the wise? You don't?
It sounds like it could be axiomatic. Like it could be a symptom that it's like, oh, if that person's wise.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
We'll all do the same thing
Yeah.
that person does.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because earlier in the sutta, he says that you shouldn't rely on something just because just because somebody who is like a teacher with a reputation or something says that. But he's also saying it in relation to other criteria. But you're saying that you can't rely on that on its own, which I think is true. I think the Buddha's basically saying you can't rely on that as just one criteria, but it has to be part of many. But what do we think about this thing of something being praised by the wise? Go on.
Also, like, another question I would have is whatever this hypothetical wise person is saying, something that he's saying, could that work for someone else and not for another person?
That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. I think that's a really good point. Yeah, I'm going to come back to that actually with something that I'm going to say in a bit. But yeah, that's true. There's not like I was going to say, like, there's not. It's not like there's one thing you can say to people that is just like a sort of a catch-all teaching, is there? I think that's the thing. I mean, it's interesting, when people used to come and see the Buddha, it would often be a personal teaching. So he would have his followers, obviously, and he would get to know them. But he would also, if somebody had a particular issue, he would try and understand a little bit about their life and then make the teaching relevant to them through that. So it's something that applies to their situation. But as you say, it could apply differently at different times in their life and so on as well. Yeah. What does anyone else think about this thing of being praised by the wise? Do we think there's any problems with it, or can we see any sort of drawbacks with it?
Well, I was thinking, who is the wise?
Who are the wise? Yeah. Who are they? How do we find them?
I guess you can be wise in different ways.
Yeah. I mean, I guess what the Buddha's talking about specifically is he's talking about a kind of spiritual wisdom, which is it's not just being wise in the sense of like one's grandmother might be wise, for example. I mean, my grandmother lived to be 100, and in that sort of worldly way, she was quite wise. But then in other ways, she was like really not very wise at all. Trying to think of an example. Remember her 99th birthday. It's nothing to do with the teaching, it's just a good story. I remember her 99th birthday, I said, Grandma, what do you want for your birthday? She went, just get us a bottle of vodka, son. And I said, but Nana, you're 99, I can't just get you a bottle of vodka. She went, not just an ordinary one, one of them ones with the little silver sparkly things in. And I once asked her what the secret was to her long life, and she said, it's vodka. She said, no, just a little bit every night. So do we think that's wise? She was very loving and very lovely, but it's that thing, isn't there? People say, oh, they're very wise. What they mean is actually they're quite worldly. Do you know what I mean?
And say that's not wise, though.
Well, there might be some wisdom in it, but I think specifically what the Buddha's talking about is seeing into the nature of reality, basically. So in a Buddhist context, that is seeing deeply the truth of conditionality, that truth that the Buddha, that the Buddha talked about soon after his enlightenment, that he said basically that all things arise in dependence on conditions, and when those conditions are no longer present, those things cease, and when those things arise, and so on. So it's like seeing deeply into how things actually work and what causes suffering and what conduces to happiness. So it's not just the sort of wisdom of how to make a casserole when you've got not much left in your fridge or something like that, or how to handle a child when it's irritated or something like that. There may be some wisdom there, but it's specifically talking about a spiritual wisdom, which is seeing into the nature of reality in order to reduce suffering and conduce to greater happiness, more compassion, more connectedness, and so on. So I think that does raise the question, though, of how do you know someone is wise? And I think one of the criteria that I was thinking is there needs to be congruence between what they're saying and what they're doing, basically. So this is what the Buddha talks about, doesn't he? Where he says that if the training is undertaken and observed, and this presents a sort of this presents something for us, which is you're not necessarily going to know that someone's wise just from listening from what they have to say. You may, and I think you get an intuitive sense of when somebody's speaking, whether they're actually speaking from their own experience or not, whether there is an actual internal experience of wisdom within them, and then if that's expressed in a congruent way. But it's also to do with how that person actually is. Somebody can sit and say very wise things, but how actually are they in their life? How are they with their friends? How are they with their family? How are they when you just see them down the street? Somebody cannot be regarded as wise if they just sort of say spiritual things and then you catch them, a week later and they're doing, they're behaving in a way that completely contradicts what they've said, basically. So there's a congruence that is needed. And also, you need to spend time with that person. You need to be around that person, basically. I think it's one of the reasons why I'm saying this is often this goes back to this thing of how do we discern what is worth listening to and what's not, is a lot of the time we get presented with teachings in isolation these days. So let's forget about all the fluff that I was talking about on YouTube. But for example, on YouTube, if you're looking at, spiritual teachings or particular systems or gurus or whatever it is, you've got no idea really of the experience of that person, and you've got no way of knowing actually sort of how that person is or who they are even, because all you do is sort of see them in a kind of in a removed state. You don't get the opportunity to actually spend time with that person, and you don't get to actually see how they are in their life. So there's no way that you can verify that. But in order to in order to actually have a sense of that, then you need to know whether someone's actually wise or not. Okay, I'd like you to get into pairs again, and I'd like you to just briefly discuss this. So have you met anyone in your life that is actually, that you think is wise, and why did you think that, and what effect did they have on you? So Buddhism, they sometimes talked about as a threefold path. It's ethics, meditation, and wisdom. Yeah, so ethics, meditation, wisdom. And it's interesting to think about that, because I was reflecting on this a little bit earlier. So the traditional way that that's talked about is ethics is obviously, it sounds like it's such a boring word, isn't it, ethics? It makes it sound like following rules or something like that. What it actually is what you do and how you conduct yourself. So what you do, what you think, what you say, how you are in the world, how you treat people, all of that sort of thing. And obviously, as Buddhists, we follow certain ethical precepts. So it's how you're conducting yourself, how you are in the world, and that has an effect. It has an effect on you, and it has an effect on the people around you. Primarily, it has an effect on your mind, and then it also affects, it's like a circle. It then affects what you do. So it's what you do and how you conduct yourself. And then meditation, you could say it's actually meditation and reflection. And then you have wisdom here, which is what I was talking about, which from the Buddhist perspective, wisdom is seeing things as they actually are. And the more we see things as they are, free of our views, then the easier our life will become, basically. We'll be more free, we'll naturally be more compassionate, we'll have more energy, and so on. So how you conduct yourself then will have an effect on your meditation and reflection practice. The degree to which you're able to meditate and reflect will be affected by how you conduct yourself. There's a reciprocal relationship between those two things, yeah? So how you behave will affect your meditation practice. Your meditation practice will affect how you behave. And those things will give rise to wisdom. So you have wisdom here at the top. But also, wisdom doesn't have to be your own wisdom. Like it will be, but it's also... the more receptive you become through meditating, the more receptive you are to wisdom when you hear it. So the more you're actually able to hear the truth, the more that can actually penetrate. If you're full of wrong views and you're behaving in a way where your experience is full of like craving and hatred, and your mind is like really, really tense and really angry, then there's no way that can break through, basically. But the more you meditate and reflect, that has an effect on your ethics, and then that makes you more receptive, which means that wisdom can come through. So it's wisdom that arises in you, but it can arise from being in the presence of others as well. And it's not sort of 100% straightforward, this, because it's not like somebody can just give you wisdom. You hear this time and time again in the Buddhist tradition. You can't bestow wisdom on someone. If you meet someone who's really wise, if you met the Buddha, for example, he can't just implant that wisdom in you. But what he can do is have an effect so that wisdom arises in you, and you then become changed by that experience. Does that make sense to all of you? Yeah. Okay. So it's worth remembering that, this relationship between ethics, meditation and reflection, and wisdom. So I'm going to start to wrap up, and I know what you're all wondering. You're all wondering what happened to the Kalamas. The short answer is they became followers of the Buddha. A lot of them became followers of the Buddha. So his teaching had a very, very strong effect on them. The fact that the Buddha completely heard what it was that they were actually asking. He heard their confusion, he heard their doubt, and he didn't try and tell them just to snap out of it. He didn't cast their doubts aside. He didn't say, well, you need to listen to my teaching because mine is the one true teaching. He explained very, very calmly and very sort of thoroughly and very, very clearly criteria that they could use to navigate their way through their own doubt. There's a second part to the sutta where it becomes clear that the Kalamas ask a second question, which is about rebirth. And the Buddha he gives them this a second part of the teaching, which is talking about basically, because the Buddha taught rebirth, but he's saying, look, if you believe me, actually, I'm just going to leave that aside. I was going to say I'm not going to talk about it, and then I started talking about it. I'm just not going to talk about it. Okay, let's leave that there. Anyway, there's a second part to the sutta, which I'm not going to talk about. But anyway, the Kalamas became followers of the Buddha. But the question is, what about us? What do we do? What can we do? We don't have the Buddha, but what we can do, I mean, presumably if you're all here, to some degree, you're interested in Buddhism. Maybe you've come because you've got nothing else to do on a Monday night, I don't know. But presumably you have some interest in Buddhism. There's if you've been coming along to the center for a while, maybe you think there's something here, there's something worth listening to, and you're in a particular context here. So you're not even just in a Buddhist context. You've come to the London Buddhist Centre, which is part of a Buddhist tradition. The London Buddhist Centre is part of a worldwide Buddhist movement called the Triratna Buddhist Community and Order. I'm part of that order. I'm an ordained member of the order. That's why I wear this white thing around my neck called a kesa. That means I've made a commitment to practicing Buddhism for the rest of my life and trying to help other people to do the same. And in our context, there's a very particular way that you try to follow the path, which is kind of in line with the teaching, actually. So the Buddha gave the Kalamas clear criteria that they could follow. So he said, look, if somebody's giving you a teaching, does it accord with your experience and intuition of what is skillful, i.e. what is helpful and what leads away from suffering and towards happiness? But he also said you can't solely rely on what others say, basically. So he was telling them to think for themselves. The title of this talk was Thinking for Yourself. But what the Buddha was saying is you can't actually solely rely on that. You can't say what others, you can't just take on trust what other people say. And you can't abdicate your own responsibility. Sometimes we need help getting beyond our own limited views, basically. And then he talked about whether something leads to happiness or whether it leads to harm or suffering. And then he talked about would it be approved of by the wise. But how is that worked out in real life? So we've got these criteria. But in this community, the question is, what do we actually do? And obviously meditation is one thing. So I was talking about this earlier. We have all of these views, which are mostly unconscious. And through practicing meditation, our views become more conscious. We become more aware of what is driving us. And we can sort of see more deeply into ourselves. And we can become aware of what it is you could almost say we become aware of what it is that we need to become aware of. But we can't just do that on our own. So in our tradition, that's why we encourage people to join study groups, where people get together on a regular basis and they study the Dharma, but you do that with somebody who's more experienced than you are. I've heard people over the years talk about, really not understanding what the value of studying the Dharma is. People say, well, just give me the material, I'll read it. And that's a completely different experience from studying in a group with other people. When you do that, you're able to examine your views and look at how you approach things and look at how you get things wrong with other people for a start, but then also you're guided by somebody who is much wiser than you are. So I've been in study groups myself. In our tradition, we usually run 4-year study groups. I was part of a 4-year study group before I was ordained. I've run 2 4-year study groups since I've been ordained. And it's really magical what can happen in that context. I've been in those situations where it's almost like a different kind of consciousness arises in the group. And the reason why that arises is because at the point when you can actually see things more clearly, when that happens with other people, it has an effect on your consciousness, and it's like it clears away, I don't know what you would call it, the leaves or the debris or the mud or whatever it is, and you can see things a bit more clearly. And you're doing that in relationship with others, which enables you to feel more connected. And you're doing that in the presence of somebody who is wiser and more experienced than you are. And if you're doing that on a regular basis, it has a profound effect. And that is different from just coming along to a class occasionally, or just reading Buddhist books, for example. There is probably nothing more valuable than you can do than study with other people. And if you're interested in doing that, we offer that at the London Buddhist Centre. So you can talk to a member of the team, or you can talk to the people here who are called the Mitra conveners, and they can help you to get into a group, basically. But it's an incredibly valuable thing to do in terms of looking at our views and clearing them away. And then this thing of needing the guidance of people that are more wise than you are. So in our tradition, that happens in the context of friendship, basically. Friendship with you could say the wise in inverted commas. You could just say people who are a bit more experienced than you are. So it's vital to actually be in relationship with other people who are practicing. So you need to be around people who share your values and share your endeavor in terms of what you're trying to do. But it's also really, really important that you're able to spend time with people who are more experienced than you. When I say that, it's interesting because that's what happened with the Buddha. That's what happened with the Kalamas, and that's what happened with the followers of the Buddha. What they were doing was, it's interesting when you look back on history and you read the Pali Canon, you read about the Buddha's followers and all of that sort of thing. We view that with a historical lens. Actually, what was happening there was friendship. That's what it was. It was people wanting to be around the Buddha because of his experience, and people wanting to be around his followers that were more experienced because they obviously had something valuable to say, and they just wanted to be near those people. They wanted to be around them. It's interesting, like when you hear the sutta, it sounds a bit like a sort of a cold clinical thing of the Kalamas going to the Buddha and saying, okay, we have a question, and the Buddha saying, okay, well, I will answer your question. It would have actually been nothing like that. What it would have been like was them being in the presence of somebody who's more experienced. And, in the sutta, it's all very neat and tidy and tidied up, isn't it? It sounds like it all happened very quickly. Probably what happened is some of the Kalamas just wanted to stay on with the Buddha and spent time with him. And over a period of time, he helped them to come to a much deeper understanding. So I don't think it's actually like always the way it's presented in the suttas. You can't. This is why we give these teachings on these ancient suttas, because they need to be unpacked. They're very, very, very dense, and they're very formulaic, but with a bit of interpretation. When I look at it, I look back on my own experience of following this path, and what I understand is that it's basically being in relationship with people that makes the difference. And that is what makes the difference to, if this path makes a difference to you, it'll be that makes the difference. It will be your friendships with people, it will be your connections with people. So when I look back on my time at the London Buddhist Centre, I've been coming here for about 20 years. I got involved at another centre originally, but I came here about 20 years ago. And it was basically two friendships for me that completely transformed my relationship with this centre. And they were both with people that I really looked up to. So some of you might know Jnanavatra and Maitreya Bandhu. They don't teach at classes so much now. But when I came along, they were teaching a lot of classes, and it was the first time in my life I'd really heard people talking with clarity and I don't know, just saying things that I'd never heard said before, basically. And I just thought, okay, that makes perfect sense to me. I want to be around those people. So I started helping out at this class, and I joined the team, and I've been doing that ever since, really. And it's not like they would come up to me periodically and say, okay, do you know that all things are impermanent? And I'd be like, oh wow, that's so profound. Or another time they'd come up to you and say, I don't know, the self is an illusion. It doesn't work like that. That's not what happens. Actually, what happens is, it's not even what somebody says at a class, really, that makes a difference. It's being around people over a long period of time. What happens is, it's funny because I was saying this thing before, somebody can't give you wisdom, and they can't. But weirdly, it does sort of rub off on you if you're receptive enough, and if you really want to grow, and you're open to that spiritual influence, then being around those people will have an effect on you. For me, it did anyway. It was a bit like it's almost like a sort of spiritual osmosis or something like that. That's what makes the difference. In our movement, we have a name for it. We call it Kalama Sutta, which means beautiful friendship, which I think is such a lovely phrase. Like, it's friendship that makes a difference. It's not just, that's not enough on its own. You need to, you need the teaching, you need to study, and you need to see how does that apply to me, and you need to work that out in your own life. But that also comes from other people. It comes from friendship. It's not done in a context where it's like somebody's just giving you a sort of an abstract teaching. It's relational, basically. So yeah, I just wanted to finish with that, really. That's what the Buddha was doing, was he was trying to be a friend to people. And that's what makes a difference, is being around people who can have an effect on you. And that's what we're trying to do at this centre and at this class. We are giving teachings, but really what we're trying to do is open up a pathway to a deeper experience of practicing Buddhism, and that happens in the context of friendship.